Welcome to the Miniatures Paintbrush. Today we're going to talk about how to thin your paints. So today we're going to talk about thinners, and there are a lot of different types of thinners. And what thinners do is they make your paint a little more transparent. They thin out the thickness of the paint to make it more fluid, to help you paint better with it, sort of like flow aid and different kind of mediums help you paint. And there are a variety of different types of thinners. Some are specifically designed to be used with these acrylic paints. Now, most acrylic paints are designed to be thinned with water, and that's going to be our first thinning medium for today. We're going to talk about water. Now, I have water that I can take from my faucet and dilute my paints, which for most people that's fine. However, there's a lot of minerals in my water since I get it from a well, and I don't want those mineral deposits to end up in my paint, possibly contaminating the paint. So, I buy distilled water, which is really cheap. You can pick up a gallon for this for like $1, maybe even less if you know where to look. And that thing lasts me for 2 years now. Yeah. So, and I use water for a lot of different variety of purposes, like washing my brushes, as well as diluting my paints and filling up my wet palette as well. The problem that I see with using water to thin your paints is that it works fine until it doesn't. Meaning that if you take it too far and thin it too much and wanting a glaze kind of consistency, I would stick to my glaze mediums to do that, because the water in itself contains this thing called water tension. And the water tension wants to pull the medium, the binding medium that's within the paint. Since it's so thin, it no longer sticks the paint together, and it'll go and separate and go onto the edges of wherever that is wet. And the middle of wherever is wet is going to leave a bald spot where the edges are going to be completely filled with paint. And I know about bald spots. The next thinning medium that I'd like to talk about is Airbrush Thinners. Now, I get this one from Vallejo, and specifically designed to use or to dilute your paint so this way it can flow better via an airbrush. So I don't know what kind of magic they use to do that. You can do it with water. Again, you risk that thinning it too much factor. And when putting paint through an airbrush, notice that it has to go through this small tip. You see that? If you can, you have very good eyes, because it's tiny. It has to go through there without clogging up your airbrush. And believe me, the last thing you want is to clog up your airbrush, because then it's pretty much a nightmare to get it all out again. So, airbrush thinner, I use it, I put 1 drop of thinner, usually to 3 drops of water when I'm thinning out my paints. If I'm going to really put like a glaze kind of coat on it, then sometimes I'll use possibly ink and then put the airbrush thinner within it to make it really thin. And then if I want to put it further, 3 drops of water. And if I want to put it further, that's when I'll start putting flow aids and binder mediums inside. Although, if you're using shades, that actually has flow aid in it, so you don't have to worry about adding additional flow aid into it. So if you are actually shooting glazes or shades, Citadel shades, through your airbrush, then you can thin it with the airbrush medium, airbrush thinner, as well as the water, and not have to worry about the flow aid as much. Now, talking about airbrush, some of the paints say made for airbrush. For example, Wicked Color. They're airbrush paint for professional. Got a little rattly thing inside. That, even though it says it's for the airbrush, just put it in the airbrush and go, I thin it out. Same thing with Miniature and Vallejo Air. model color, I thin those out as well. So, and thinning it out only helps you gain more control, so I think it's worth it. Isopropyl alcohol. I usually use 91%. I never used 100. This is used to be seems to be the sweet spot when it comes to using rubbing alcohol to thin out your paints. Now, some people, Luke APS, which is another YouTuber, says he uses it for everything. Now, I've never done that. I'm leery about that. That's my personal thing. I have to experiment more about that. But I do know that I use two products to thin out my Tamiya paints, which are here. And these are acrylic paints, but they're not like your regular, normal acrylic paints, like your Vallejo, where it's purely water-based. For this one is flammable. See a little fire symbol right there. So there's more to this acrylic paint than just water, I'll tell you that. So, two things I use to thin this out. One would be rubbing alcohol, which thins it out greatly. And there is a specific thinner right here. It has propanol. It also has an alcohol, so this is an alcohol-based substance, but it's propanol and butyl alcohol, which I am probably chopping up how to pronounce those things. But they are flammable, so you're working with flammable items. Now, why in the world would I want to work with flammable items when I'm working on miniatures? Because, honestly, the one I'm holding in my hand creates great blood effects. This is the original Blood for the Blood God from the Citadel lines. This is what a lot of modelers used instead of that before they actually invented that acrylic paint. And it works well. In fact, I like Tamiya products. I do like working with acrylics. I've worked with enamels before, but they're hotter material, but that's for another topic. Okay, next up. Odorless mineral spirits. I like odorless mineral spirits. There are other thinners that you can use instead of odorless mineral spirits. One of them being paint thinner that you can get from your hardware store. And that has an odor to it that I do not like. Gives me a headache. So, you know, especially if I'm indoors using it, I take the mineral spirits. And what I use to thin this down with are oil paints. Now, I like to use Winsor & Newton Series 1, Series 2 oil paints that come in a tube like this. And I like to thin these out, especially when I'm creating washes for my miniatures to get into the little crevices. I don't like using shades as much. I use pin washes for this, and that's where you're just locating where you want your shadows and just putting a drop of it and allowing this, especially because I'm using mineral spirits, to creep into all the cracks and crevices and really have that highlighted detail. Now, the thing I like about mineral spirits and using that in order to thin my oil paints is that after it finishes drying, and I recommend 24 to 48 hours to allow that to dry completely, you can go back with a small either Q-tip or cotton swab or even a brush, and you can just take off the excess where it landed where you didn't want it. Now, there's one thing and an advantage that you can use using an oil wash that you cannot use with using Citadel shades, is that if you're not pin washing and you make a mistake, you can clean it up with more mineral spirits, because it just takes that much longer to dry. And you could always reactivate it by using more mineral spirits. Does it take longer to dry? Absolutely. Is it more controllable, and is the result worth it? Absolutely. So that's up to you. So generally, thinners in and of itself is anything that dilutes paint. So any kind of medium that you use to dilute paint is going to be technically a thinner. Another thinner that I use is window cleaner. I use this brand right here. You can use other brands. There's Windex and other kind of things. This is any kind of glass cleaner for windows. And it has alcohol in it as well. And this is why, like Luke's APS says that you can use alcohol for other things, because if you thin your paint with glass cleaner, what's stopping you from thinning it with alcohol? Now, that's diluted a little bit with some water, the actual glass cleaner. So if you're going to use alcohol, you may want to thin that with water as well, so it's a little diluted, so you can use that for your thinning medium. So why thin your paints? You thin your paints to have more control over painting your miniatures, so this way it's more forgiving when you're trying to paint your miniatures, and you're painting in layers instead of painting it, just thick one coat passes that rarely, if ever, looks good. So if you want to increase the quality or up your game of your painting, thin your paints. Well, if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll catch you next time on the Miniatures Paintbrush.